Well, let's begin this morning then. We're going to flip things around just a little bit this morning so that we actually are going to be praying at the end of this particular session today. So we're going to jump right in to the teaching and emphasize the points that we need to make today. One of the movies that was really powerful and important after 9/11 was entitled Tears of the Sun by Antoine Fuqua. And the title card, when you see that in a movie, it means that it's the very first image that you see in the film. And in this particular case, it's a black screen, and what you see on the screen when that movie first comes up is this statement: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It's a very famous statement from Edmund Burke, who was an English statesman, conservative English statesman from the 18th century. Well, I want you to notice that this kind of statement is pretty repetitious throughout culture. Here's another one. This is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. If you're not familiar with him, he was very much of the outspoken defender of those who were under the auspices of apartheid in South Africa, ending in the 1980s and 90s. And his comment is, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If you are neutral, you are already being unjust as far as he's concerned. Sounds similar to what we saw Burke say. Albert Einstein, with his own comment, makes this statement: the world is not dangerous because of those who do harm, but because of those who look at it without doing anything. And by looking at it, he meant by looking at those who are doing the harm. By the way, all of these quotes are on your handouts, so you can have all of those at your disposal if you're so inclined. Very important comment. That the world is dangerous because we don't do anything to make it undangerous. Abraham Lincoln, one of the great presidents of the United States, says to sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards of men. So the idea of standing up and saying something when we see what is wrong or unrighteous. And then, of course, coming fully back to Edmund Burke, all that is required for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. That's the idea that runs through all of these kinds of concepts. Well, gee, I wonder where that kind of idea actually comes from. Well, Fuqua, Tutu, Einstein, Lincoln, and Burke all owe Amos big time. Because this is right out of Amos. Amos says, seek good and not evil, hate evil and love good. And in so doing, to go along with the context of this, I think it's necessary for us to at least read the context, read the piece of this that's important, which is from Amos chapter 5, verses 10 to 15. So I'll read this particular passage just to give us a sense of things here. They hate him who reproves in the gate, and they abhor him who speaks the truth. Therefore, because you trample on the poor, and you exact taxes of grain from him, you have built houses hewn of hewn stone. You shall not dwell in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, and how great are your sins. You who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe and turn aside the needy in the gate. Therefore, he who is prudent will keep silent in such a time, for it is an evil time. Seek good and not evil, that you might live, and so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. So here we have the context of this famous idea that we're supposed to hate evil and love good. And the idea, of course, within the framework of what we're dealing with in terms of suffering. I often struggle with the issues that face me as a man, as a community person, as a teacher, as a professor. I struggle greatly with some of the things that I see in front of me. I honestly don't think that these questions are too hard. I would say to you that the why and the what and the who are the really easy questions in life. They're just kind of right there, pretty obvious. If I'm a Christian, I'm going to live a certain way. But I'm going to tell you that the how and the when, those are the toughest questions that I face. How do I speak and when do I speak? How do I act and when do I act? Those are the things that frustrate me the most. Actually, this is the background to a famous film called Casablanca, if you've ever heard of it. It's pretty famous. This particular movie has encapsulated within it this very idea, because here you have an American who's living in Algeria, and he's trying to understand how should he confront or navigate the waters between the Vichy French and the Nazis and those who are the freedom fighters themselves. How does he do this, and when does he speak up, and when does he take a stand? That kind of idea was certainly true in America, and it certainly reflects the isolationist views of America in the late 1930s and early 1940s, of course, until the 7th of December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. So all of that was to introduce this week. This week is our 8th session in this concept of suffering. And what I wanted to emphasize this particular week was our responsibility and need to run toward the pain. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that all institutions are corrupt. Let's start there. But guess what? The reason why institutions are corrupt is because I am. So all institutions are made up of individuals. So as soon as we make statements like, the culture is bad, it's coarsening, the fiber of society is loosening, things like this, we have to recognize the fact that this is on us, because it's us that's society, it's us that's culture. That's really imperative for us to understand. I also want to always understand that the problem begins with me. It's not a me versus them issue, it's always a me issue. So as I mentioned last week, we talk about the prophets, and the prophets emphasize this first person plural pronoun constantly. And the reason is because they're including themselves within the sinfulness of the nation. That's really important. And so it's not a, gee, I see all of this awfulness going on outside of me, and I see all the problems out there. The problem starts right here with me. So I'm supposed to speak against evil? Well, sure. But now what good will I do? What is it that I'm going to do that's going to benefit and uplift, and then by so doing, cut down and marginalize the evil that I see around me? Now I'm going to say a few things this week that's going to make probably half of you mad most of the time during this particular session. I'm telling you that up front so that you can kind of get ready for this, so that you can know already that I'm going to be mad at Mark for about half of whatever he has to say today. I'm going to emphasize that because those who only want to talk about loving the good, you will not like it when I say things about hating evil things. And those of you who only want to talk about hating evil, you will not like it when I say you have to love the good. You'll get this as we go through. So, about Amos. Amos was written to the northern nation, that is to Israel. It's kind of confusing sometimes, just as a sidebar here. We talk about Israel, we talk about Judah. They were actually two different nation states after the split, after Solomon's reign. And so when we're talking about Israel today, we're talking about the northern nation of Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel. This particular book, or these prophetical writings, were written about 760 to 750. Those dates are pretty important to what we'll say to go alongside of that in just a few moments. Amos was kind of this outsider kind of person. In fact, it says in the 7th chapter, in the 14th verse, that he was the son of a fig picker. Now, I just like saying fig picker, and so I wanted to put that in on this slide because I like the fig picker concept. You can take from that what you will. It's just kind of a cool word to say out loud. So Amos was not somebody who was in the middle of, let's say, the palace central. He was not as Paul was in the sermon that we just heard about Caesar's palace. He was an outsider from the south. Actually, he was from the far south in Judah. And he was prophesying to the northern kingdom. So just imagine yourself now. Here you are, the northern kingdom. Things are going pretty well for you right now. And you're thinking to yourself, who is this pipsqueak Amos guy coming from the south, who, by the way, we really don't get along with very well, we don't like, and who is he to talk to us about anything? Always be wary of outsiders, because outsiders bring with them a voice that we don't normally hear. And you can pick a sphere within which that might fit, politics or education or any kind of vocation. Watch for the outsiders. Amos is one of those. Now, when we talk about Amos, we always have to go back to the book of Deuteronomy. If I haven't said this before, let me make this very clear. The whole of this First Testament, after Deuteronomy, owes everything to Deuteronomy. So if you want to understand the First Testament, you have to understand Deuteronomy first. Amos and all the prophets are looking back at Deuteronomy, to the law in Deuteronomy, to say what they had to say. So you'll notice that the passage I just read and the emphasis on loving good and hating evil comes right directly from Deuteronomy. And here it is. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live, out of Deuteronomy chapter 30. It's really important and powerful that we understand that, because we have to understand that folks who were getting these prophecies against them in places like Amos had had this message for centuries. So it wasn't as if this was the night before and they were caught unawares in what they were having to deal with. Amos is a very interesting book, because even though he speaks to all nations, he's holding his nation to a higher standard. Now, I don't have the same proclivity toward geography and maps that Scott Dean does, so I didn't bring a map today, but I do want to help you to understand that when you look at the book of Amos, if it's been a while since you've read it, literally the book of Amos is a geographic concentric circle of judgment ending with Israel. So it begins with the outliers, these outlying nations, and literally circles in over and over again to Judah and then ultimately to Israel at the end. And if you actually map it out, you'll see this concentric circle moving, and it's almost like a whirlpool. You see God's focus coming right into the nation of Israel. Well, when you hear about Amos and the northern kingdom of Israel, it's important to know that they had no help in leadership. They had 0 good kings. None at all. Judah, on the other hand, had 8 good kings that they could actually rely upon. And you'll notice that because of this, and I honestly think that leadership is hugely important, and because of this I think that Israel fell earlier than Judah, because Judah actually pushed back against some of the sin, pushed back against some of the evil, but the northern kingdom fell first in 722. It wasn't until later on that the southern kingdom fell a century plus later. I think that there are universal principles of leadership, and they matter everywhere, and we don't have time to kind of unpack or unload all of those this morning, but highlight this as you think about the book of Amos, if you go back to it later on and say, you know what, all of these judgments, all these words, focused on Israel, yes, but they apply universally to all people. So God basically gave 30 to 40 years for people to repent, which is really important to understand. Once again, this was not an overnight, hey, this is going to happen tomorrow kind of bit. This is at the height of Israel's influence after the nation was under the auspices of Solomon, which is important to understand. Israel's problem in Amos, if we go back to a place like 2 Kings 14, was that they were economically prosperous. This was a very good time that Amos was speaking into. They were politically autonomous. They had military security. They had everything going for them. All things seemed quite good in the realm that Amos was speaking into. Now, if you were living in that time, you would kind of look at Amos kind of sideways and go, come on, man, things are good. You know, back up. Climb down, clown. This is just not cool, you know. Does this sound vaguely familiar at all to anybody? Like, you know, maybe a nation we live in? Possibly. Could be. So, before I say what I'm going to say, I have to say, I am not speaking against politics as a vocation. I am not speaking against people who hold political office. I think that people who are Christians ought to be in political office, ought to be involved in politics, ought to be invested in politics to the nth degree, as far and as fast as they can be. I wanted to say that up front before I show you what I'm about to say.
Now that you're...
Yes. So you notice that I've tried to be equal here and pick 2 individuals from the 2 major parties. I want everybody, including myself, I start with me, to be wary of the air of smugness in conservatives who always know what's right, and the air of superiority in liberals who always think they do what's right. And I feel that constantly, especially on social media. I see this on a regular basis through memes and statements and people becoming unglued for one cause or another against one person or for another person for whatever purposes are there. I feel this in myself, and so, as I always say to you, I'm basically preaching to me, so you're all just listening today. But this is a really important concept to get across. This is not about a certain mindset or a political point of view that's true or right necessarily. Be wary that we do not run after the same purse, position, or power which perpetuates evil. Whatever that might be. Doesn't matter if they've got an R or a D or an I after their name. It doesn't matter. What matters is, have we succumbed to the idea that political, military, or economic success or power is going to be the basis upon which we live our lives? Now this week, a lot of stuff happened. Like yesterday was Candy Day, okay? You notice on Facebook, if you follow me on Facebook, Robin and I took a selfie, of us handing out candy to the kids. We had a great time. We call it Candy Day because you get in trouble if you name it other things, and so we tried not to do that. There were all kinds of political discussions that took place. The Royals beat the Mets last night. I mean, all kinds of things happened this last week. But something else took place this week, and that is that we have a new Speaker of the House. His name is Paul Ryan, if you missed that. Now, what's really fascinating about this is that as Nancy Pelosi is handing the gavel to Paul Ryan, who is representative from Wisconsin, he ran for the vice presidential chair for the Republican Party in 2012. Just some ancient history being brought back here, very important stuff, because what Paul Ryan said was, in his speech to all of the folks that were in the audience, all of his colleagues, he said, "If you pray," and he left that hang in the air, which was wonderful, because some people don't pray. And so then he said, after a moment, he said this, let's pray for each other, Republicans for Democrats and Democrats for Republicans. You really need to go and watch this thing on C-SPAN or CBS or whatever Yahoo thing that you do to watch things. It's about 13 minutes long, which is punctuated by huge, long applause lines. And I emphasize this not because Paul Ryan is who he is, or because he has an R after name, or even because he comes from Wisconsin, with all generosity of the Green Bay Packer fans. My point in emphasizing this is his generosity and grace. And that's what I emphasize here. May his generous and forthright spirit shape his words and his work into the future. You don't see stuff like this in politics all that often. And so when I see it, I want to put it in front of people and say, hey, look, this is possible. We might actually be able to get along every once in a while. Wouldn't that be nice? So, bringing us all the way back to the issue of suffering and the pictures that I showed you at the beginning, when I talk about running toward the pain and dealing effectively with loving what is good and hating what is evil, we have to see this in tension. Because quite frankly, we have to live this way. We know that there's evil, and we hate the evil, and we know that there's good, and we do love it. But sometimes we feel like this stuff is just rubbing up against each other, and it's just like this power struggle. Guess what it is? Colossians 1:12 and 13 says that there's a kingdom of darkness and a kingdom of light. And when we think about these kinds of things, we think about hating evil and loving good. And our responsibility is to push back the darkness. So Amos 5 again, the emphasis here, the sovereignty of God, our responsibility as human beings. So, again, I might just urge you some caution. Do not throw heavy objects in my direction. Are we looking both ways, I want to ask? Are we hating the evil and loving the good? You know what I would love to see in the New York Times? I would love to see two contents side by side. 12 million Syrian refugees need shelter. And right next to it, a dictator responsible for the 12 million refugees needs to be stopped. Could we please do both? Could we say, yes, I want to love the good and help the refugee, but can I also say I want to hate the evil person and the evil work that this person is doing and all of the people that are helping him and all the people not helping him? Could I be so bold to stop the evil? Are we as concerned with the latest injustice by police as we are concerned about the latest murder of a police officer? These are things that rankle people, and rightly so. Whatever side you tend toward in that discussion, It's important that we see both sides as necessary to love the good and to hate the evil and to run toward the pain. So, a few words about hating evil and the imprecatory psalms. Imprecatory psalms are songs like Psalms 109 or 137, which include prayers for the punishment of God's enemies. Calling down judgment on adversaries is both very human and very troubling. It's a response to evil on this side of heaven, bearing the image of God. Because we do, his character including justice, we want justice, just as much as we want love, because we bear that characteristic of God as well. And so guess what? We resonate with movies such as this one about death sentence, which was portrayed by Kevin Bacon. His family is wiped out and killed, and he goes and gets the bad guys. Or Jodie Foster in The Brave One, where she is attacked and her friend is killed, and now she's going after revenge and retribution. Neither of those words, by the way, are words that we should succumb to as Christians, but nonetheless, the reason why we resonate with this is because we don't see enough justice, and we want it, and we desire it. And so in light of that, imprecatory psalms invoke curses on others. It seems to be very difficult for us in this age of tolerance, where everybody's supposed to be nice to each other, and for believers who are called to love their neighbor. And by the way, that phrase comes directly out of Leviticus 19. This didn't just pop out of Jesus' mouth. He's actually quoting the book of Leviticus. So when we talk about these things, we begin in the First Testament teaching. So when we talk about hating evil, we talk about indignation, anticipation, and expiation, which means we're going to place the guilt on somebody else, or we're looking for that guilt to be applied. There is no justice. If there's no justice after life, then we better get justice here. That's the problem. But for Christians, obviously, this is all something we anticipate into the future. By the way, all of these comments are on your pages as well. A seventh one on this list that I've given out of the dozen that I've put on your pages there is that we have this tremendous indignation when we see injustice, as well we should. Because we have this, we want to make sure that we hate the evil that we see around us. And we see a movie like Gran Torino with this wonderful portrayal by Clint Eastwood, who literally does what this last statement says here on the slide. This unadulterated innocence of Jesus' sacrifice. What is the best way to overcome evil? It is by sacrifice, literally by the blood of Christ. And ultimately, that's what we depend upon. Now, we resonate with other movies, like The Equalizer and Man on Fire, both by one of my favorite actors, Denzel Washington. We resonate with these things because, again, we see evil, and we see this guy dealing with evil, and it's one guy basically against the world, but he takes care of business. And we like that. We like that because it's resident within our being to like that, because we want God's justice. But understand that it comes this way. When we talk about Amos, when we talk about Deuteronomy, we talk about any teaching from First Testament emphasis, we understand that the psalmist, when they are declaring imprecatory psalms, they are calling upon the loyalty of the covenant that God has established with them. We expect you to take out our enemies because you promised that you would. Again, hating the evil is not up to us. I don't go around with my 44 and start blowing away the bad guys. What I do is I rely upon the covenantal loyalty of God that He will take care of those issues. Are there structures and law and order within our culture to take care of those things now? Sure. But nonetheless, we don't always see it, and we want it. And that's why movies like this resonate with us. Or, in the finality, evildoers will be overthrown. And one of the greatnesses of the teachings of eschatology, which is the study of future things, is that the bad guys are going to get theirs. Psalm 73, a passage that we looked at early in these particular sessions, emphasized this very idea. The Jewish people took right and wrong more seriously than other people do. And I wonder that about myself, about my own nation, about my own culture. Do we really take right and wrong seriously? I suspect we tend not to. So that's the hating evil emphasis. So what are we supposed to do in terms of loving the good? Well, I'm telling you up front, I have this tremendous love for the Marine Corps. So right up front, I want you to know that, and I also want you to know that they have this tremendous commercial that's been running for over a year. And this commercial begins with this huge smoke-filled environment. There are explosions, people screaming. And then you hear people running. And then you see soldiers running. And the narrator is saying out loud so everybody can hear, there are some who run toward the chaos. Do you want to be one of those? And of course it's a commercial for the Marine Corps. The idea is that they're running toward the chaos. They're running toward the pain, that's what they're really invested in. That's what we're looking for in people. Well, how do we deal with that? I'm not in the Marines. I can't do those kinds of things. Here is this wonderful statement that's, again, on your pages if you're interested in following up with this. I was just talking with Matt this week about his great statements in this particular article. He wrote this: broken cities need those minor leaders who cultivate in their own corners a community's moral foundation. Think about the emphasis of that. How can you in your vocation, how can I in my vocation begin to cultivate moral formation within the world in which we live, within the influence that I have in whatever world that is, whatever area that might be? When I think about this, running toward the chaos, I think about 10 basic principles. If we see evil and turn away, we've only become part of the evil. James 2, 1 John chapter 3 says the same thing. If you see somebody in need and you don't meet the need, that's a problem, big time. Number 2, building relationships with others opens the door to discuss pain. The only way that you're going to have any kind of communication with anybody is if you get to know them. And the last thing you want to do is start hammering them with the King James Version, because that's the first thing out of your mouth. The first thing out of your mouth ought to be, hey, tell me about your life. Talk to me about your family. What is life like for you? Building relationships with people. Strengthening small group, grassroots institutions is where battle against chaos begins. Did you know that there are 10,000 nonprofits in Indianapolis? 10,000! I was amazed by this. And when you stop to think about all the good work that nonprofits do, ask yourself the question, can we encourage those kinds of small group institutions who are dealing and focusing on very specific narrow bands of interest? We do not allow anybody's pain to be censored or left out of public view. One of the things that really aggravates me, especially as I watch my culture and I'm reading all the time, is what I see and what I don't see in the major media outlets. Some things are talked about and others are not. And that's wrong. We ought not to leave anything out in this discussion of loving what's good. When we silence others through shaming their ideas, perspectives, or approaches, we help continue the pain. So if we leave anybody out, and in addition to that, if we make fun of them in some way, whether you be a liberal or conservative in your political points of view, that's not appropriate response of loving what is good. Persuading others to respond to others' pain demands the voice of the powerful, the privileged, and the well-positioned. Do we have positions or places in this particular culture with a voice that other people don't have? Because you might have an executive director position or a president position, or you might have some kind of responsibility that directs money in a certain way. What do you do in that sense of things? We are privileged in those kinds of areas. We do bear our power in those things, and we do have positions that we hold, and we have to ask ourselves the question, how are we using those to love the good? And then teach by doing, and being there means that we have earned the right to be heard by participating in the pain. Something that amazes me about our pastors is that we have 3 different pastors who have their children in 3 different school settings: public, homeschool, and Christian school. And that is never talked about. That's never an issue really around here. We don't ever discuss it really too much. But what amazes me about that is that a pastor like Scott Dean, for instance, can have an impact in the public sector because his kids go there. Homeschooling for David Peters and his family. He has a voice there. So these kinds of positions that we hold are really crucial and important. If we're going to love the good, we do not vilify those who stand for another's pain, even if we disagree with the cause, because pain and chaos are everywhere. Pick chaos. Pick some place to shine your light. But don't get upset with somebody else who's shining at someplace else that you don't really agree with. Be careful of that. We're committing to a way of helping. So give it our all. Stick to it. Don't blame others who don't care for our focus, because they have their own focus. Let them have their focus. Encourage them in their focus, whatever that might be. And then we can only know, be, and do so much. The horrors of our world go viral. We cry out to God knowing we cannot attend to every horror, but we push back the pain in our chosen chaos. Be very wary that every week we do not hop on some new awfulness and make that our weekly concern. Focus on where we are, with what we can do to love the good and to hate the evil where we are. That doesn't mean that we don't sympathize or empathize or even contribute in some way, in some senses. But that the weekly terror that we see around the world, we have to decide where we're going to place our energy and our time and our talent and our money. Again, back to Edmund Burke, a different statement, however. He talked about loving good by loving the little platoon that we belong to in society. Think about this church as a little platoon, a small group of people that's going to make an impact in the culture in which they live. And then at the end he writes this, a trust in the hands of all who compose it. Each one of us bears responsibility for this little platoon in which we exist. So whatever we contribute, whatever good we can do, is the good that we can do and what we can contribute. And we shouldn't think, well, I didn't give enough or I didn't do enough. Hey, if you're participating in some way, that's a really helpful and important idea. So, let me give some examples of people who are loving the good. This particular picture is of the graduation ceremony, the last graduation ceremony at IMPD, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. The second guy from the left, his name is Gerson Cardona. Gerson has been my student in the past. He invited me to his graduation, and I heard some tremendous speaking at this graduation. We heard the assistant mayor, for instance, in Indianapolis speak, an African-American man who basically preached the gospel. And then we had an invocation and a convocation prayer by the chaplain of the Indianapolis Police Department, who had no problem talking about Jesus all the way through his prayer, by the way, which was pretty impressive. When I think about loving the good, I think about these guys and what they're doing to keep us safe. And they've taken on a whole new approach to policing. They call themselves guardians now instead of warriors. And this concept now of policing is changing in Indianapolis and changing the way the culture is thinking about policing. And here we have Gerson Cardona, a fellow believer, a brother in Jesus, who writes on his Facebook wall, I see how I am an agent of redemption in the culture of Indianapolis. I think about one of my former students, Lawrence Cameron. If you go up north, up toward Anderson, please don't speed because he might stop you there. Lawrence went over in 2003 into Iraq. He was in the Army. He's seen battle himself, but a wonderful man. And had him in my Old Testament classes. A great man who wants to go on and get his PhD and minister to people in churches and in communities and in nonprofits. When I think about agents of redemption, I think of my friend Kevin Russell, one of my students. He's the one to the left. Kevin works for the Department of Corrections. Kevin is all geared up. He came to we had lunch or breakfast a couple weeks ago, and he came with his full gear, and people were looking at him, with his flak jacket on and everything. It's really interesting. On his business card is the phrase, Agent of Redemption. On his Department of Correction business card, Agent of Redemption. That's what he thinks of himself as. And he's standing next to a guy who's just been out of prison, by the way, who was the vice president of the Aryan nation. Awesome. Just letting that hang there for a moment. This is the good work that guys like Kevin and Lawrence and Gerson are doing. And last but not least, I wanted to reintroduce you to a man who was here this last year when I was teaching last fall. His name is Claude Robinson. One of his responsibilities as a master's program, he decided he wanted to shadow me and every time I taught. So he was here in our classes last year, if you recall. Claude is now teaching for Ivy Tech. He's been in the insurance world for 35 plus years in Indianapolis, and he said, I want to give back to the community. And so now he's teaching courses that have to do with policing and about law and doing great work. He is the one, Claude is the one who introduced me to a group called 100 Black Men who actually have their organizational structure emphasized in Atlanta, but they're all over the nation. And they choose 100 black men in their communities to lift up and disciple young men, of course. And this is part of what Claude does as loving the good in his community.
So here are a number of great examples of what we do here. Again, this is on your page, but this is what we do. We protect those whose lives are in danger. We attend to the needs of others in pain. We defend those who cannot defend themselves. We speak out against the brutality of bullies in the world. We shine a light in the darkness. We run toward the violence when the alarms are sounded. I mentioned to you that I love the Marine Corps. I do. I love police officers and the work that they do. I love those in Department of Corrections. I love those in whatever vocation that they're in, they're doing and loving the good. And if you were to ask me, well, what do you do to do this? Because I think that's a fair question to ask anybody. So I'll answer the question. My responsibility to hate the evil and to love the good is to write and speak and teach. And to do research that focuses on things like this so that other people can be encouraged and uplifted in those kinds of avenues in which they have a position and a privilege and a power to enact change in the world in which they live. So we all don't have to go to seminary to learn something brand new. We just take the passions that God has given to us in the place that we live to exercise those things, to hate the evil and to love the good. I mentioned to you that I was going to end this particular session today with prayer instead of start it with prayer, but I'm not going to do the praying. I'm going to let Major General Dondi Costin pray for us. This particular video prayer was an invocation at the USO just about 10 days ago. It's gone viral. It has 400,000 hits already. And I show this to you because Dondi's my friend. Dondi and I were Facebook messaging last night, and I was telling him that I was going to be using his prayer in my teaching this morning. Dondi is now oversees all the Air Force chaplains in the whole of the Air Force. And he was in my PhD program, and we graduated together in 2009. Dondi is a class act, a wonderful man, and I want him to have the last word today as he prays this wonderful prayer that will not only encourage you, but give us some exhortation about the kinds of lives that we ought to be living.